pessoal, eu sou o Rodrigo e vocês vão ver agora a entrevista que o Eduardo e eu fizemos com o historiador Carlo Ginzburg há alguns meses. A entrevista foi feita por ocasião do episódio 10 do Passadorama, o nosso podcast, que teve como tema o moleiro Menocchio, personagem estudado em um livro clássico do professor Ginzburg, O Queijo e os Vermes. Então, se você ainda não ouviu o episódio, é só procurar o Passadorama em qualquer aplicativo para podcasts. Carlo Ginzburg é italiano, ele nasceu em Turim em 1939 e é filho de dois intelectuais muito importantes, a Natália e o Leone Ginzburg. Ele foi professor em diversas instituições, como a Universidade de Bolonha, na Itália, nas universidades de Harvard, Yale, na Universidade da Califórnia, em Los Angeles, nos Estados Unidos. Sua bibliografia é muito extensa, vários dos seus livros estão traduzidos para muitas línguas, inclusive para português. Textos como O Queijo e os Vermes, objeto central do nosso último programa, Mitos, Emblemas e Sinais, História Noturna e vários outros são considerados textos básicos para a formação de historiadoras e historiadores em vários lugares no mundo. E o impacto do Ginzburg na historiografia contemporânea é muito grande, seja por conta da micro-história, da história intelectual, da história da cultura, da história das religiões, enfim. Vocês vão notar que eu estava bastante nervoso durante a entrevista, o que fica evidente com a piora do meu inglês, que já é naturalmente péssimo, o que vai ser minimizado com as legendas e com a versão dublada da entrevista, que vai ficar disponível no feed do podcast. Então, gostaria de deixar aqui os agradecimentos do Passadorama para o professor Ginzburg e Eduardo, corta para a entrevista.
Well, first of all, how are you? Are you feeling fine?
Fine, yeah. I mean, the situation is difficult everywhere, but, yeah.
Yes, you've been in isolation.
A very privileged situation, as you can understand. I mean, surrounded by my books, there are an excellent library which is open, and I'm glad to be involved in those conversations like this one.
That's nice to know. I actually have your book over here, The Cheese and the Worms.
Yes.
Yeah, Rodrigo has one as well.
Yeah, right.
Mine is older.
Yeah, this book, I borrowed it from my mother-in-law a couple of years ago, and I don't know if she remembers that I have it. She's gonna find out through this interview, so I'm curious to see her reaction.
Yeah.
As I told you, we're a podcast from Brazil. We talk about history, culture, and politics. And we're making a very special show about The Cheese and the Worms. And we're deeply honored to have you with us. Your work has been a huge inspiration for us throughout the years. It really means a lot to us to have you here. It's a really special occasion for us.
Thank
We're
you.
a little bit starstruck, actually, because in Brazil, in the history world, you're kind of a rock star.
Well, I'm flattered, of course.
So I'll hand the first question over to Rodrigo, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Eduardo. Professor Ginzburg, first of all, I would like to thank you for this interview, not just in the name of Passadorama, but as a historian. When I started as a history student in 1998, O Queijo e os Vermes was the first book I acquired. It was the subject of the modern history final exam. And at the time, I had a little glimpse of the countless possibilities and horizons that could be opened up through historical research. And being able to talk to you today is a great honor, but I will try not to be too emotional.
Okay.
I will pass to the first question. In one of your books, this book, História Noturna, one of my favorite books of all time, and you wrote that to research the past is to journey into the world of the dead. It's the last sentence of the introduction.
Yeah.
Well, by means of one of these journeys, you managed to introduce us to Domenico Scandella, Menocchio. So the first question I'd like to ask you is why did you choose to write about this particular individual? Beyond the academic research of it, what is about this character executed 400 years ago that drew you to him in a more personal level?
Well, I mean, I came across the name of Domenico Scandella, nicknamed Menocchio, while I was working on my first book, based on the Friulian Benandanti. And I was checking a handwritten list of the first 1,000 trials performed by the Inquisition in Friuli. And this handwritten list had been written by an inquisitor in the early 18th century. And the volume had been stolen from the ecclesiastical archive, and it had been bought by the local library in Udine, by the communal library in Udine. Now, this was a sort of a lucky circumstance for me, because at that moment I was unable to enter the ecclesiastical archive. So I was looking at this volume, this handwritten list, which was a list with short resumes of the trials, the first 1,000 trials. And so I was going on, and I found other trials against Benandanti. I came across one of them in Venice. This was in the early 60s. It was in 1962. And then suddenly I came across a short resume of a trial against a peasant. This was Domenico Scandella, and he believed that the world had emerged from rotten matter. There was no mention of worms, but I was struck by this. I mean, it was the anomaly which struck me. In other words, I used to say that I'm, let's say, shocked and interested by anomalies, because anomalies always imply norms, but the other way around is not true. In other words, a norm cannot include all the possible violations of the norm. So, I mean, I took a note about that trial, and I went on reading that volume. Now, 7 years elapsed before I started to work on that trial. I mean, it was in my mind. I remember that there was that strange note. And even if I would have been able to look at the trials against Menocchio, I was working on the Benandanti, then I worked on something else. And then all of a sudden, I had started to teach in Bologna, and I decided to go to Udine, and I started to read the trial. Now, those trials, in fact, there are two. Now, I mean, I say the anomaly. Actually, that anomalous idea about the, let's say, emergence of the world from rotten matter was just the beginning, because then I found many other anomalies, starting from the fact that Menocchio was able to read. Now, this was completely unexpected. And then what did he read? And then, I mean, all kinds of books, including Boccaccio's Decameron. So, I mean, I was really taken by this, and then taken by that man. Taken by that man, in other words, there was something about him which was completely mesmerizing. And then I tried to convey this kind of emotional and intellectual relationship between myself and him in my book. So yeah, that was let's say the. I'm trying to answer your question, but there were many other possible answers, if you like, more answers.
It was great. Thank you, Eduardo.
So the cheese and the worms influenced a whole generation of historians here in Brazil. Most interestingly, it managed to reach beyond the traditional academic spaces. Since its release in the 1970s, the book has spawned theatrical adaptations around the world, as well as a film in Italy, and it remains popular to this day, even among non-specialized readers, people who aren't history students and professors. Why do you think that Menocchio's story still resonates with readers to this day? And what do you think that says about our world today?
Well, a new edition of the book has been published in Italian last year, I believe, or no, maybe just a few months ago. And actually, I added a postface. And in that postface, I also tried to answer the last part of your question. Because first of all, I said, okay, there are all those translations, and I'm obviously extremely pleased by that. And also by the fact that not only professional people, professional historians read the book, but even, let's say, a larger audience. And this was, let's say, something which was part of my project in a sense. Although, as you can see, I mean, there are, let's say, footnotes, learned footnotes, but I mean, the idea of addressing two audiences at the same time was part of my plan. Now, I think that, let's say, the main reason for this, let's say, reception, wide reception, was Menocchio's personality, as I mentioned earlier. In other words, there was something so special about this man, and he has been able to speak, let's say, beyond centuries and beyond space to people from different backgrounds, different cultures, and so on and so forth. Then there are two, let's say, issues which are, let's say, at the very center of the book. On the one hand, there is, let's say, the challenge to authority, to authorities, let's say, both secular and ecclesiastical, or should I say, both ecclesiastical and secular. And then there is, let's say, the interaction, the friction, and the interaction between oral culture and written culture. Now, both issues are, in a sense, translatable, insofar as, let's say, they can be immediately understood and in some way experienced, maybe through generations, in, let's say, nearly the entire globe. And so all cultures can experience, let's say, this idea of challenging authorities on the one hand, and I mean, a large part of the humankind went through this interaction between an oral culture and written culture. But then you asked me something else at the end of your question when you said, "What's the meaning of this book today?" Now, at the end of the introduction, I mean, when in the first edition of my book in 1976, I said that on the one hand, Menocchio is kind of contemporary, but on the other hand, it belongs to a completely different past, a past which has been erased. And I also mentioned a sentence by Walter Benjamin about, let's say, the recuperation of the past through a redeemed world. And I said, turning the sentence from a messianic tone into a secular tone, I said redeemed, that is liberated. But then after nearly 50 years, I can also say something about, let's say the potential use of this book today. And I mentioned global history. In which sense? Well, an Italian historian wrote an essay saying that the notion of popular culture, and he made an explicit reference to my own works on that topic. It's a sort of, let's say, outdated topic. It has no interest anymore. And I said, this seems to me myopic, to say the least. In which sense? When we are confronted with global history, and I'm taking global history from the point of view of res gestae, from the point of view of history, not from the point of view of historical writing, because we have to make a distinction. I mean, global history as a phenomenon is something which is, it started centuries ago, and it's going on and on at a very quick pace. But it's not something which emerged in the last decades. And then there is the notion of global history from the point of view of historical writing, which is, I would say, one of the possible answers to that phenomenon. So I'm, let's say, taking into account global history as a phenomenon, and I say, when we are confronted with continents like the Americas, Asia, Africa, in which, let's say, we have, let's say, European colonization, which lasted for centuries and produced documents in which the gap between the colonizers and the colonized is comparable to the gap which took place in Inquisition trials. So my oblique approach to Inquisition trials can be, let's say, not immediately, taken as an example, but can inspire an approach to documents, not necessarily court records, but also court records, but all kinds of documents produced by European colonizers. So in that sense, I think that, let's say, this book has possible use, can inspire different kind of research. I can add just, if I have time to do this, I can add a little anecdote.
Surely, feel free.
I was in Moscow many years ago, and I received a phone call from an institution whose name is Memorial. And the institution has been collecting evidence about the Gulag, about the trials during the Stalin era, and at that time was fighting for human rights in Chechnya. And Putin regime is not particularly happy with this kind of with this institution. So I was familiar with the name of Memorial, and they said, and I said, but why are you calling me? I was surprised, and they say, we would like to have a public conversation with you. And they said, but why? How? I was flattered and astonished. And they said, we read your essay, The Inquisitor as Anthropologist, and we would like to have a public debate on this. And so the debate was, and I was really surprised and moved, about the possibility of using my approach to Inquisition trials in order to work on trials, political trials, short trials, as they are called, during the Stalin era. So, historians work using analogies,
That's amazing. I didn't know that story. Actually, your book has inspired similar works here in Brazil as well by other historians studying different individuals during colonial times here in Brazil as well. I think Rodrigo knows better than I do about it.
Professor, the next question will follow the same path of your last answer. When reading about the Inquisition during medieval and modern ages, it's easy for us to attribute religious intolerance as a thing of the past, as if it were something we've overcome as a society since then. But unfortunately, as we know, religious intolerance remains present to this day. On the other hand, reading about Menocchio, he seemed to have, in some aspects, quite a tolerant view regarding different types of faith and belief systems of his time. Even though he was an outlier, we believe it shows that the past is not black and white, and as we sometimes think. It has a lot of gray areas, just like our own world. In your opinion, how can the study of the past change our perception of current times? Can history help us to be less ethnocentric?
Well, for sure. In other words, I think that, let's say, we have a sort of a provincial bias, provincial in a metaphorical sense. So it's egocentric. Actually, I mean, I wrote an essay. I don't remember now whether it has been translated into Portuguese. It was written in English, and I published it years ago, but maybe I should check. But it's called in English, Our Words and Theirs. It's about the dichotomy which had been suggested by the American linguist and anthropologist Kenneth Pike between ethic and imic. So Pike said we have to make a distinction between the language, the categories used by the observer, and the language and the categories used by the actors. And so on the one hand, we have the ethic perspective, which is shaped on phonetics, and then the imic perspective shaped on phonemics. So the last one is the related to the categories of the actors. Now, I started from this. I found this very instructive. I think the dichotomy are interesting, especially because you can reshape them. And this is what I tried to do. In other words, Pike said the ethic perspective is the scientific one. And I thought this is a bit naive. In other words, if we look at the historical knowledge or at knowledge as a process, as a trajectory, I mean, we have to realize that historians start from anachronistic questions related to our present. Anthropologists start from ethnocentric questions related to their own background. And we could even say that when we are engaged in a dialogue with an unknown person, there is a tendency to start from categories which are, let's say, related to our own experience, instead of trying to learn from our interlocutor or from documents about the past, documents about other cultures. But this learning is possible. So starting from ethic categories and learning from imic documents, imic categories, this kind of interaction seems to me a more realistic perspective of what historians do or should do. I say should do because if, let's say, historians project their own categories, they behave like ventriloquists. So it must be more complicated than that.
Thank you. Eduardo?
Menocchio lived in a world which was rapidly changing, in large part due to the invention of the printing press, which revolutionized communications and knowledge. in current times, a lot of the political and cultural and social transformations we're living through, well, they as well have a close relation to another communication technology, which is the internet. More than ever before, we are routinely bombarded with tons of information. And taking into consideration the recent discussions about fake news, alternative facts, and conspiracy theories like the flat earthers, how do you think the internet impacts our relationship and understanding of facts and sources?
Well, I mean, I've been reflecting on this topic for many years. And many years ago, I wrote a little essay in Italian. There is an English abridged version, but the essay is called, in Italian, Conversazioni con Orion. Orion was the name of the software of the UCLA library. And I argued that there are different uses of internet. And there is everybody, including myself, is certainly using internet in order to find answers to our questions. But there is also a different, more oblique, more sophisticated possibility to use internet in order to find unexpected questions, and then more unexpected questions. And then, a trajectory which ultimately will send us to a library, to a book, or to a book on internet, who knows. But it's possible to construct a research starting from, first of all, a sort of openness to the role of chance. I'm fascinated by, let's say, the fact that in Italian, caso and caso, a case and a chance, are in fact the same word, both of them related to the Latin word cadere, to fall. And so I tried, I wrote a piece called Chance, Cases and Chance, and so on and so forth, because I'm fascinated by the way in which we may start from a deliberate creation of chance events, events on the screen, and then we may start from that. So noise, the technical word, which is, let's say, a target for technicians. In other words, technicians working on internet, they would like to avoid noise, becomes, in fact, in my perspective, also a possibility of research. And so we have to create noise in order to look for something more specific. But there is this openness to chance. And this seems to me important. I remember that at the end of my little essay, I mentioned, first of all, a famous passage by Leonardo da Vinci, when he said that a young painter must learn to look at moistened walls in order to discover landscapes, faces, and so on. Fascinating. And then I also mentioned, let's say, the Max Ernst, the surrealist painter, who used to take objects and to take a piece of thick paper and then to create frottage, in other words, to create a sort of visual counterpart of this chance assemblage. So, I ended with those examples, but you may easily translate this into one's research. And actually, I gave a couple of examples. I can go on, but maybe this would be too long.
Well, you can take your time if you feel like it. Well, actually, it's quite interesting that you talked about art, because our last show was about the history of the arts, and it's funny because the cover of the episode was a painting by Courbet, Gustave Courbet.
Which one?
The Origin of the World. I think.
Yeah. Sure.
And it was censored in Facebook.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pass it over to Rodrigo again.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo. Professor Ginzburg, it is well known that your family were a part of the Italian resistance against the rise of Nazi fascism in the middle of the past century. We are currently living in a dramatic situation here in Brazil, which we know is not exclusive to our country. Once again, we are seeing authoritarian right-wing governments, which some call neo-fascists, and Professor Enzo Traverso would call post-fascist, and they are coming to power around the world. And it has also become common for us to see the world leaders openly criticize civil rights policies. As a public intellectual who lived through the aftermath of the fascist regime in Europe, what are we doing wrong as a society? And if there is room for analogies.
This is
Tough question.
a difficult question, and I don't think that I have a real answer. I mean, what is striking is the fact that, well, first of all, I strongly dislike the word populist, because I'm thinking about the Russian populists, and I think that it's a shame to use this word in order to designate Bolsonaro, Trump, or Salvini, and so on. But having said this, we have, let's say, a new kind of right-wing governments, or I wouldn't say parties, because I think that, and this is part of the problem, there has been a collapse of parties all over the world, I would say, parties in the old sense. In other words, and certainly internet is related to this. In other words, the physical presence of people debating in a room and so on is something which is now, let's say, unreal. And, so what we have is, let's say, this overpowering presence of internet. And there is no doubt that the leaders I mentioned before have been able to use internet probably in a more effective way than, well, I would hesitate before saying the left, because I wonder whether the left exists as such. Certainly, I mean, this is a question as far as Italy is concerned, but not only Italy. So the use of internet is extremely important. And you mentioned fake news. I think that, and I say this, I wrote this in several occasions, that, let's say, the fight against fake news is extremely important. And we have to use a kind of electronic philology in order to fight against fake news. The model I used to mention is Lorenzo Valla's treatise on the donation of, and against the donation of Constantine. So in the 15th century, this Italian humanist wrote a little treatise against a document, an ecclesiastical document, which, let's say, spread the, we would say today, the fake news that Constantine, the Roman emperor, before dying, gave 1/3 of the empire to the church. Now, Valla demonstrated that this document was a fake. And he used let's say, kind of mixture of different tools, including anachronism. In other words, linguistic anachronism as a clue of the fake. Now, it seems to me that we have to learn from this text. In other words, to debunk, to destroy a fake news is possible. And I think that philology, in a broad sense, should be used as a tool. And we have to teach people, starting from young people, to use philology in this sense. So, as I said several times, if we lose the notion of truth without quotation marks, we are lost. We are lost, and it's clear that we are defeated because let's say, the winners will be Bolsonaro, Trump, Salvini, and so on and so forth. That's clear enough. So truth and the ways of fighting for truth, starting from philology in this broad sense.
Thank you, Professor. And I will follow the social dimension of your answer, and I will make another question about this. There's an article of yours that was recently published here in Brazil, in which you write about shame.
Yeah.
In the text, you discuss shame as a feeling that binds individuals collectively in a society. Here in Brazil, we have a great expression, which is vergonha na cara. It means literally shame in the face.
Yeah.
I think it's because the blush. To put in context, when someone says or does something they know is wrong, it's common for us to respond to that by saying, you have no shame in your face.
Right.
Something like that. In that respect, having shame is somehow considered quite a valuable moral quality to have in our society. With the advent of the internet and of the social media, which currently intermediate so much of our social interactions, do you think it has somehow become easier for people not to share this collective feeling of shame, or not to have vergonha na cara?
Well, I mean, it is a very good remark, because I think that in a sense, let's say, internet create a distance which is very different from my physical interaction. So the very act of blushing is something which is, let's say, invisible on internet, so to speak. But I mean, when we take shame in a broader sense, I think that this makes still sense, even in the internet era. I mean, many years ago, I started, this was the beginning of the starting point of my little essay on shame. I say to myself, why am I ashamed of Berlusconi? Now, and the answer was not obvious. I mean, first of all, I didn't feel guilty. I mean, being guilty is something completely different. But then I started to ask questions to friends of mine from different countries, saying, would you accept the idea that one's country is the country we can be ashamed of? And after a couple of seconds, they said yes. I mean, I was saying this when I was teaching in Los Angeles, and I was asking myself this on the basis of my reaction to Guantanamo. I was horrified by Guantanamo, but I was not ashamed. In other words, there is a sense of belonging which is related to shame. Now, there are also exceptions. I remember that at the end of my essay, I quoted a very moving and troubling passage by Primo Levi about the Red Army entering Auschwitz. So let's say shame as related to belonging to the humankind. Okay, there is also this extreme possibility. But so at the end of my essay, actually, I argued for a notion of an individual, which seems to me potentially interesting, also because it's incompatible with the widespread idea of identity, which I detest. In other words, I think that the identity can be used at an emic level because there are a lot of actors using this notion, and I mean, both today and in the past. But the analytic value of the notion of identity is zero. I mean, it's a political weapon in order to create a boundary. But I mean, if we start from this and we ask ourselves something about ourselves, okay, I would say and in a way anticipating my answer, which would be an individual is the point of intersection of a series of sets in a mathematical sense. So I belong to the humankind, I belong to the masculine moiety, I belong to, let's say, a small group of Italian professors retired from American universities, and so on and so forth. And then there is that set, which has just one member, meaning the fingerprints. But if I identify myself with my fingerprints, well, this makes sense in certain contexts, in the context of a, let's say, police investigation, for instance. But for a historian, this would be absurd. Now, all this may seem banal, but I think the outcome is maybe not so obvious. In other words, an individual is the result of an ongoing interaction between generic, less generic, more generic attitudes, behavior, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Professor.
Well, we have a special question for you. Our podcast, it's about history and culture, but we also have a science fiction aesthetic about it. And
but
it's common.
They are different.
Yes, that's important. Well, it's common for us to speculate about future worlds and dystopian societies, things like that. So in that regard, Professor, I'd like to propose to you an exercise in speculative fiction, if I may. If you were a future historian, let's say 400 years from now, and you were to write a micro-history book about an individual of the long gone 21st century, our present time, which kind of individual would you want to write about if you could choose?
Well, I would start with chance.
With chance.
You know, because I mean, your provocation is about cases, and I say that let's start with chance. Then we'll see. You know.
Yes.
It worked with Menocchio.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Well,
very well.
I'm not saying that all cases are equally fruitful, but I think that we have to start. I mean, I think that let's say, and I'm projecting myself into this distant future, I will have to fight against my biases. So my, let's say, provincial, in quotation marks, attitudes, starting from my own experience. And so I will have to find something unexpected, therefore chance, you know.
Yes, I imagine. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add to our conversation, Professor?
Well, I'm very happy about this conversation. It was unexpected, full of chances. And so I'm very grateful.
It was really a privilege to speak with you. And well, we'd like to thank you for your time, your kindness, and for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Professor. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Rodrigo has an interesting T-shirt that I gave him.
Ah, yes. He gave me this T-shirt. Because...
Send me a picture.
Yeah. Yes. Every time...
I'll send it to some members of my family.
Okay.
Okay.
Every time in our show, and I quote some of your work, and Eduardo gave me this gift, this lovely gift.
Okay.
We will send you a picture.
That's fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ginzburg.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Bye.
See you soon. Take care.
Take care.